Okay, so welcome to week 8 of WDD. Today we're going to be talking about JavaScript. So we've gone through like CSS and HTML, and then now we're moving on to kind of the last section of the course on JavaScript. And today will be a very gentle introduction to all of that. So some quick announcements is homework 6 is due now. This was just the mid-semester survey. So I would encourage you all to do this if you haven't already. I think it's a very easy 4 points, or even if it's late, it's a very easy 2 points. It should really take less than 10 minutes. So remember, you can keep turning on late work until the end of the semester. So get that done. And also the usual weekly homeworks are going to resume this week. Homework 7 will be released soon, and it's going to be due next Tuesday before class. Lab 7 is also released soon, as in tonight, and this will be due Friday midnight, just as usual. And keep your eyes out for the final project. I want to congratulate everyone for doing a great job on the midterm project. And then now we'll get started with the final project, but you have until really the end of the semester. This is going to be the last thing that's due in this class. So you'll have a good amount of time. We're just giving it to you early so you can start thinking about what you might want to design. So we saw this little picture throughout the course where we had HTML, which represented the structure or like the skeleton of our page, CSS, which represented the design or like clothes that the skeleton might wear. And lastly, we have JavaScript. So JavaScript provides all the various functionality we want on our page. For example, if we click this button, something might happen. If we click this element, maybe this will move the other element around. If we hover over this, then maybe it'll move something else around, rearrange the page, hide something, show something, all of that. We can really be a lot more flexible with everything that we're doing once we add in this JavaScript aspect to our page. So what we'll be talking about today are these 4 questions. What is JavaScript? What can we do with it? What does it look like? And a couple hands-on basics sprinkled throughout. So what is JavaScript? JavaScript is a programming language. So if you've learned about like Python or Java, it's very similar, but we'll use it in very different ways. And if you haven't, then again, this course is designed for people that haven't had much coding experience or any at all. So don't stress too much about that. And this is completely different from HTML and CSS that we've seen before. And it's also very different from Java. Once we start looking at this JavaScript code, you might realize that if you've taken something like CS61B, then Java might look a little bit familiar, and this might look a little bit familiar to Java, but how we're using it and the functionality really is just very different. And this is not so scary. I know that it's kind of intimidating learning your first like actual programming language, but again, we're here to support you throughout this. And I think just like HTML and CSS, you can break it into smaller parts and learn that more like digestible bits. So just like we wrote HTML and CSS to tell our browser what we wanted things to look like, now we're going to write JavaScript in the same way, but to tell the browser what we want those elements that we defined with HTML and with CSS to actually do. And what can we do with it? Our goal is to write JavaScript code that will add interactivity to our pages. Specifically, after we have this HTML code, which is our skeleton, and our CSS code that kind of organizes and stylizes the skeleton, then now we can use JavaScript to move those around, add various different types of interactivity, and really a lot of things that you can and can't think about. So some examples are pop-up dialogues, or image carousels, like you see on Instagram that you can scroll through some images. That's going to be one of the upcoming assignments. And anything you see something like a menu being expanded or hidden, maybe you click a button, something appears, you click it again, and it disappears. That can all be done with JavaScript. JavaScript also works on the back end, but we won't go into too much detail with that, particularly for this class. So here, we want to think about this kind of interactive functionality. So we'll think of a feature to add to our web page, like when a user clicks on a specific button, then we want to add or change or remove some HTML or CSS, depending on that action. So I'll go through a really brief demo talking about what that might look like. So here we have some very, very basic code. We have in our HTML, we have this green div and this blue div. You see here we stylized them so that this is a green circle, this is a blue circle. All of this you've seen before, there's really nothing new here. What's actually new is this chunk of code right here. And let's take a look at what this does first, and then I'll break it down piece by piece, just so we can see how JavaScript works and different things it might be able to do. But if you don't understand any of this at all right now, that's completely fine and completely expected. So if we run this, if we click this green circle, then this will change colors. And we click it again, it'll change colors again, again, again. And as we saw previously in the class, we were able to do some things with CSS, for example, animations or transitions or pseudo selectors, where maybe we clicked on this red, and while we clicked on it, it would change colors. Or we hover over this red circle. As we hovered over it, it would change colors. But there was nothing really persisting on our web page, as in we don't click something and then something has like a permanent change, as in it doesn't immediately change back. And also we weren't able to change this element by interacting with this element. We could only change the element that we were currently interacting with. Again, JavaScript opens up a lot of new possibilities. We can click this, something else will change. It'll change again, it'll change again, and then it'll just keep changing. So very, very roughly, we'll define all of this in lecture later, but green circle is kind of putting a name to this HTML element, or as we call a variable. Blue circle is, again, defining some variable or just giving this set of like CSS and or this piece of like HTML code a name. We'll call that blue circle in our JavaScript. And we have this function. Oh, it should be. Okay, so we have this function where this circle that was originally blue is going to change colors. We define this. We have some code in between that you don't really need to understand right now. And we say, as we click this green circle, this blue, or as we click this green circle, it's going to trigger this function. It's going to trigger some sort of action that's going to change something on our page. That something on our page is this blue circle, and the thing changing is the color. So again, this code you don't have to understand, but hopefully this gives you a little bit insight onto why we want to use JavaScript versus something like just CSS, just HTML. Any questions about that really quick demo? Okay, if not, then we'll move on. So some examples are, just gonna click through all of these, are when a user clicks on a specific image, then increase that image's size. So then we could do that by changing the CSS width, right? As we saw in the previous slide, all the way over here, when we click something, then we want to add, change, or remove HTML or CSS accordingly. What we're doing with JavaScript is we change something on the page, but how do we change something on the page? We change something on the page, which is represented by HTML and CSS, just by adding or removing or changing some HTML and CSS. Another option or another example of something we could do is when the user clicks on this button, then change the colors to dark mode. This is also an assignment that we're going to do in this class. And how that works is by just changing CSS colors and background colors across the page so that maybe all your text goes from black to white, or your backgrounds go from some sort of white to some sort of black, etc. Or when users click on this tab, change the content, as in hide the first div, show the second div. We'll do a sort of like Spotify assignment that plays around with this concept. Or when a user clicks on the up arrow, then increase some number that's displayed on the page. Again, if we were just doing this in CSS, we wouldn't be able to increase the number constantly. Maybe we could say if we click the arrow, then the number might change. Or if we click the number, maybe then some kind of styling might change, right? With like hover effects or with like on-click effects. But we can't have this complicated functionality without JavaScript. So what is JavaScript's role in a web page? When we write HTML, it just shows up when we open the HTML file. When we write CSS, all the changes that we have in CSS show up if there were CSS selectors that refer to specific HTML elements in the HTML page. For example, in the example that I just showed earlier, that little demo, right? We had some sort of circle, that was the HTML, and then we gave it color, we gave it a size, we like rounded the corners to create that circle. And that was because we selected some specific HTML element and applied these CSS properties to it. But what about JavaScript? JavaScript is a little bit different in the way that it's not just going to show up on the page unless we tell it to modify something. So earlier, again, we told it to modify some HTML or CSS. What we did was we selected we selected that originally blue circle, right? We told it to modify the CSS by modifying the background color, and then that is what caused that change in colors. So for now, all of this code kind of lives in the console, and that's a little bit complicated and a very abstract concept for now that we'll play around with more. But for now, JavaScript, just think about it as a little bit different from HTML and CSS, where it's more like specific actions and instructions rather than just things that display on your page. Oops. Okay, so how do we try this out? This is just something that you can refer to once you start doing all of these JavaScript assignments. Just like with CSS and attaching that to HTML, we want to create a new file. This time we call it script.js instead of like styles.css. And we put it into whatever folder we want in our website. And similar to the link tag in CSS, where we linked some style.css file, we also have to attach our JavaScript file to our HTML page. Remember, everything just goes back to that HTML page. And the difference is for CSS, we would put it inside the head tags, but now we want to put it after the closing body tag, and we want to add this line right here. This is a script tag. It has an opening tag up to here and a closing tag here. And source is just as usual, same rules as always. The file path must be correct. So always double check that that's correct if you think your JavaScript code isn't working. And again, here, there is a closing tag. So different concepts that we'll explore today are variables in JavaScript, what console.log does, just playing around with alert just for fun, even if that's not something that you'll really use for your websites, and talking about strings and functions. And the goal is to be able to read basic syntax and to do some basic math within JavaScript. So starting off with variables. Variables are just like variables that you see in math. We use a variable that we want when we want to store the value of something and give it a name. For example, those blue circles and those green circles in that demo earlier. So here we have let. Let means that we're creating a variable that's block scoped. I'll talk very briefly about what that means. And we have the name of our variable. Here, the name is just name. Here, the name is age. And we have the value here. So if we want to store some sort of text, we have to store that in quotes. And that's what we call a string. However, if we want to store just some sort of number, for example, 0 or 1 or 2 or 20, we don't need that around quotes. We can just simply type the number just like this. And some motivation behind this is, let's say you want a string that says the number 20, right? Or you want some text that says the number 20. If you want it to be stored as a text and treated as a text, you would treat it as a string by putting quotes around it. Whereas if you wanted 20 as just simply the number, you would not want quotes around that. So each variable has a scope, a global or local environment in which it holds a defined value. And if you aren't too familiar with programming, this will be quite confusing for you, but we don't really need this too much in the scope of the class. What we really want you to understand is that to define variables in JavaScript, we can either use var, like var name equals Joe, or let, like let name equals Joe, or const, like const name equals Joe. Each of them have different scoping functionality. And if you're interested, or if you've had like quite some coding experience before, I would encourage you to go through these slides, but I'm not going to go over this in too much detail because I think it might just confuse most of us here. What we will say is, in order to define variables, for this class, TLDR, just use let. Just use let to define all your variables, whether it's some text, like a string, or whether it's some number. Use let, don't use var, don't use const. Just know that if you see var and if you see const online, those are also, like, if you're trying to find some sort of code, or like you're just Googling to see how things work, if you see var or const, just know those are also ways to define variables. But in order to avoid any specific scoping issues and to make sure that you can complete the homeworks fine the way we designed it, just use let. So I guess we'll stop here really quickly. Does anyone have any questions about any of that I just went over? Where could we find these slides? Sorry, I should have posted this before lecture, but one of the TAs, do you mind putting this on the portal right now? This is just in the usual folder that we have. Yeah, sorry. We will have those up in just a couple minutes, but yeah. So moving on, if we don't have any other questions about the content, we'll talk about string concatenation, which is just a fancy word for putting text together or combining multiple strings into one single string. So we can add strings just like we can add numbers, and here are some examples. So if we define this variable name, let name equals Nicholas, then name now is the string Nicholas, and we can define another string called greeting. That's howdy space plus name plus an exclamation point. And if you put that all together, it'll look like this. So we have these variables. How do we actually make JavaScript show up? Well, we would do that by using console.log. And the console is, we mentioned that the console is where like your JavaScript is stored, but you can also run JavaScript directly in the console for any website. So I guess we'll play around with that for the alert function. So another way to make JavaScript show up, just for fun, again, you probably don't want to use this on your websites because it'll get very annoying for users, but a more interactive way to make things show up is by using the alert function. So here we have let name equals Miles, like greeting equals howdy plus name plus exclamation point, and then alert greeting. So we can try that right now. So if we go to inspect on any web page, it'll open up this thing right here. Well, again, we'll have an assignment that helps you kind of play around with that, and we'll have TAs try to go over that in one of the labs. But if we go over to console, you can ignore all of these warnings for now. But inside console, we can simply run our JavaScript code, and it'll be kind of like attached to this website. So we say let name equals Miles, and then let greeting equals howdy plus name, right? This is string concatenation. So we add this variable, which is actually just the string plus an exclamation point. Nothing happens there because we're simply defining a variable. If we want this to show up, we can do console.log greeting. That'll simply just return it inside our console. But if we wanted to show up on our website, we could say alert greeting. And then now this will pop up, right? I'm taking my hands off the keyboard for a second. And now we see this pop up right here. This is a physical pop-up on Chrome, right? We can play around with this. We can highlight it. We can click OK. That kind of gets rid of it. And if we run it again, it'll just keep doing this. So running this alert function is a good way to test maybe if some of your code is working. It's something that you can do just for fun to play around with. But you can imagine that if you do this many times for like different clicks throughout your website, any user is going to be very annoyed because it's kind of like interrupting their normal flow of using the website and just sticking this like really fat alert in the middle of a page that they can't move past until they click OK. Kind of like an ad. Okay, slides are up on Notion. Thank you for asking about that, and sorry that's a little bit late, but should be able to find it there now. So another example of string concatenation, a little bit more complicated, but kind of just like things that we've seen before. When will the homework be posted? Homeworks are all created already. I think one of the staff is having a little bit of a delay, or they just got a little busy, but we'll have that posted probably like right after lecture by midnight tonight at the latest. So for this particular question, can someone type in chat, or I guess a couple of you, anyone that has any ideas, what you think this alert will output? Just like we had earlier, right? This sentence is now a variable. That's some concatenation of multiple variables that all represent strings. So can someone type what alert sentence would output, what that little pop-up would say on our webpage? Yeah, all of you are very close or correct. what would actually appear is I love WDD without any spaces. Correct, yeah. Because each of these, they don't have a space in between. Whereas we saw earlier with the howdy thing, we had a little space here, right? We intentionally inserted a space here so that there is a space right here when we alert that. However, here there's no space. So just be wary of like when you're doing string concatenation on whatever project you have, right? You want to combine multiple strings together, either have a space over here, or you can do course plus space plus person plus space plus emotion plus exclamation point, and that'll say I love WDD with spaces. So now moving on to some basic math. We can do some math with our variables. We have plus, minus, multiply, divide, and mod. We probably won't really need this for this class, but what this is just like 4 mod or 5 mod 2 is just like 5 divided by 2, and then it'll output the remainder. So let age equals 20 plus 5. This age is just going to represent the number now 25. And this second time that we're accessing age, you see that the first line was let age equal 20 plus 5. Here we don't include this let keyword anymore because we've already defined this let variable. We've already defined this age variable. All we're doing now in the second line is reassigning or updating this age variable to a different value, and we're assigning it to 20 minus 2.5. So originally it was 25, now it's going to be 17.5. Let double age is going to be age times 2. Again, we're accessing this variable right here, which will have a value of like 25. We're multiplying it by 2, and then now double age is going to be equal to 25. Math is very, I guess, straightforward. Things in, or like this kind of basic math, right, in JavaScript is kind of just as you would expect. Yeah, that's all I really have to say about this. But stopping again briefly for questions. Any questions about string concatenation or about basic math? Okay, if not, we'll move on. So the last thing we'll cover today are going to be functions. And this is where things get a little bit more complicated and a little bit more foreign. So functions are also a bit analogous to math. We promise this is not a math class. This is the most we'll say math in any lecture, but a function takes values as input, does something to that, and then outputs a value. So if you've seen like fx somewhere in some math class, right, that's sort of what this is. And this is useful if we have a piece of code that we don't want to keep writing out. For example, if we have some operation that we want to square some number, which again, because this is not a math class, it's probably not something we'll have to do very often, but this is just an example. Here, we're defining a function. Here we have a name for the function, right, called square. Here we have function parameters called, I guess in this situation, just x. And then we have this right here, x times x. This is what this function is doing to whatever you pass in. You pass in an x, it's multiplying it by itself, and then return means that this is the final output value. So we can play around with this again in our console where we can run JavaScript code. So if we do inspect, back to console. So you see here now we have a function, and then if we type square, it'll say this is some sort of function, but this function doesn't do anything until we call it. So now we can say square 4. And then what that's going to output is 16. If we do square 5, that's going to output 25, 6, 36. So let's say we were creating some website where we had a reason to write this square function because we were going to square numbers multiple times. Maybe we don't want to have this let result equals whatever return result multiple times. Instead, having just this defined function makes it a lot easier for us to reuse a lot of this code. And once you write more complicated JavaScript functions, you'll really see the benefit of this, where you can define some function and use it over and over again. So your JavaScript file isn't like thousands of words long if you were just doing some like basic function calls. However, functions don't always need to return a value. For example, you can define another one. I guess I'll just run this function as well. So we have this function show greeting. And then let greeting equals howdy. This is sort of just what we were doing earlier, plus name plus exclamation point. And then we want to alert that greeting. Now we have our function defined. And now if we do show greeting, you see here that it does this alert because it's running whatever is inside this function, right? It alerted howdy J. Yeah, it alerted howdy J just like it alerted howdy Miles earlier. But nothing is really returned here, right? We see this undefined thing. This value doesn't, or it doesn't output anything. If we try to assign something to the output here, we would just get some sort of undefined or null value. But all you need to know is that functions are a way of just like grouping together some code together that we want to run. That could be just multiple tasks together that we deem is close enough in relation to kind of wrap them around this single function. And now we can run this over and over again. If we do like this, now we say howdy Isabel, and then we can run this over and over again without repeating code here. So last thing is, just like in HTML and CSS, we can also write comments in JavaScript files. So here with this double line, this is a single line comment, and we can use this to describe what this function is. And documentation and just commenting out and explaining what your code does is very important for other people to understand what your code is. For example, if you come into office hours, so we can read through your code and see what you're actually trying to do, and also for your own organization. If you write a lot of functions, the functions get very large. Maybe each time you don't want to understand what each of the functions are doing by reading through the entire function. Instead, if your comment is clear enough, then all you need to do is read the single line comment to understand what the function does and how you want to use it. Alternatively, you can do slash star or asterisk and then whatever text you want in the asterisk and then another slash. And this will create like a multiple line comment, as in the comment won't end until you have this asterisk slash at the very end. I guess I lied. This is the very last thing. So the question here is what is returned, and try to type this in chat. So we have this function do something that passes in, that takes in like two parameters. So course and number. It does some stuff and then returns this res value. So take a couple seconds to look at this and then see if you can figure out what it does and just type that in chat. I see there's already one answer. Does anyone disagree? Okay, if not, Wesley is correct. The output is I've taken WDD 100 times. We see that we pass in some number here that's going to be 10, right? This first parameter corresponds to this course right here. The second one corresponds to this. So we take this number, which is 10. Inside here, we update the value of num to be 10 plus 90. So now num equals 100. And then we have this res. I'm not really sure what this is supposed to mean, but we set this to a string, which is the result of some string concatenation, which is combining multiple strings together, that says, I have taken space course, which is going to be WDD, because that's what we pass into this course value right here. So I've taken WDD, and we remember num is now 100 and not 10. So I've taken WDD 100 times. And we return that. So now something is going to be the quote, I have taken WDD 100 times. Okay, so that's it for the first JavaScript lecture. We'll have a couple more of these to get into more specifics about how you would actually want to use this on your website to achieve certain functionality. But for now, we just wanted to give a quick introduction of what it looks like, how things work, functions, variables, and all that. So any questions? Otherwise, yeah, I guess any questions first. Okay, cool. Then I'll stop sharing here. We'll take a quick 5-minute break, and then I'll pass it off to Isabel for the design lecture.
Time to share a screen. Hello. Okay. So what we're going to be going through today for the design lecture is an introduction to human-centered design. So this in particular will be pretty important to anyone who's interested in pretty much going to design professionally or just even looking into it a little bit more. So this will apply to web design, but also other things, say product design, industrial design, architecture, anything like that. So we'll be going through it. So let's decide or define human-centered design first of all. So HCD is a design approach that incorporates the human perspective in your design process. This means that we are empathizing with others and understanding how humans work, and this helps us design things that are actually useful and effective to people. So this is kind of the design process that we go through. We can see that it says analysis, design, evaluation, and implementation. But looking more closely at this, we can look at how analysis means user research and defining the problem space. So looking at exactly what a person needs and figuring out the problem that we're trying to solve here. In design, we're looking at ideation. So after researching exactly what the problem is, we'll be looking closely at how we can come up with the solutions. Evaluation, so how we can test whether our solutions work. And then implementation in terms of how we can actually put this design into fruition. So we'll be going over like all of these concepts in a little more depth. So let's start with user research. User research is mostly looking at how we can empathize with our potential users. So we're asking questions like, what do our users actually need and want? How our users actually interact with the product or similar products. And we're looking at how we can figure out the problem instead of deciding for ourselves what we think the problem is or what we think other people need from us. So some potential user research methods that we can look at include interviews, surveys, maybe doing card sorting. So this includes observing users, reflecting on their experience by grouping different ideas, or we can actually do our own research, maybe by reading existing resources and observing people in their natural habitat. So by doing this, this means that we're kind of getting our problems from real people's experiences instead of assuming we know what the problem is from maybe our sole experience, rather taking a good sample population and understanding what a group of people would face. So this means that we get to define the problem. And this is important because then we actually know what to design for and who we're designing for. And then leading into this, once we figured out exactly what the problem is that we want to design for, say we're designing a website for people who are looking to get information on where to get their COVID vaccine. And people have told us from our research that there's no, the website they're looking for, it doesn't have information on locations or it doesn't have information on availability. How do we look at these findings and synthesize them into, I guess, insights on exactly what we need to target and how do we figure out exactly who we're trying to appeal to or who we're trying to solve the problem for? So one thing we can do is making personas. So personas are kind of characters grouping each kind of person who might be looking to use this design. So for example, going back to our example with the COVID vaccine website, there might be people who are elderly. So people who are maybe looking for accessible design, people who aren't super familiar with the internet or super familiar with website design. And then say we might have, I guess, frontline workers who are also looking to see maybe where the vaccine is available or where they need to deliver more. So by grouping these characters or grouping these needs into certain characters, we can further streamline exactly who we're designing for and kind of gear our design towards actual people who will need to use this product. Another thing we can do is make a journey map. So this means making a timeline of the user experience from the beginning of when they're using the website, or maybe from the beginning of when they need the website through to the end of the process after they've used it. So here is a visual example of what a customer journey map or journey map looks like. So this is an example for someone who's switching mobile plans. Say at the start, they're trying to review the current plan, they're trying to figure out what new plan they need, and then at one point they get to compare different offers. So they might see another plan on TV, they might see other plans through research, and then they go to negotiate. They're calling other carriers, they're calling competitors to see what they can offer, and then they choose a new plan. So it's like breaking down all the steps in this person's experience, trying to select a new mobile plan and figuring out at each point, how does your design kind of accompany them, or how does your design accommodate them at each point? How can your design interfere at each point to say, push your mobile plan? Or how does that exactly feed into their experience? So not only thinking about how your design might just exist alongside a person, but exactly in time, in whatever stage they are, like with the problem they're solving, how can that accompany them, or how can that interact with them? And finally, another possible tool that you can use to kind of synthesize your findings and help you make your design is making affinity maps. So this just looks like taking your research and maybe grouping it into different observations and ideas. So say going back to our COVID vaccine example, maybe through our research, we've talked about how locations are hard to find, or how people find it difficult to get directions to certain locations or find transport to certain locations. And then maybe you'd group all of these under an idea of having a map on your site or having an interactive map on your site. So it's about thinking about what concepts recur through all the different people you've talked to in your research, and then grouping them into different ideas so that you can kind of isolate the different recurring themes and make sure that they show up in your final idea. So at this point, after synthesizing all of your kind of like user research, you can think of an idea, or you can think of your concepts and make sure that they're stemming from the user research and from your findings. So the rules of thumb, best for this, I would say, are being empathetic. So your users' needs that you've come through with from all the surveys, from all the interviews, are definitely more important from what you think is cool, or like more important than what you think is cool, right? So you might decide it would be really, really cool on our COVID vaccine site if we could make it so that you sorted them by which COVID vaccine sounds the coolest to you, or by which hospital is the nicest in terms of interior design. But what the users really want are maybe like a way to sort by maybe which vaccine is being offered, or which hospital is most accommodating to like disabled or wheelchair using people. So you need to make sure that you're actually listening to what the people who you're designing for want. The second one is being observant. So make sure you think about repetition and trends. So with that links back to affinity mapping, maybe looking at different recurring themes, and then also making sure you're thinking about edge cases. We do think about the main user groups that we came from with our character profiles, but also, are there any people that you've missed out here? How do people feel when they're using your design? And then the third rule of thumb is being open. Obviously, as designers, we can't always cover everything, but just making sure that you can always understand that there's more to learn, there's more to possibly consider in design, there's always more to iterate on. That helps your design ideas grow. And then finally, being inclusive. So thinking about who you haven't considered yet and how you can consider them to make sure that your design can appeal to different people and can help different people. So let's say that after all this synthesis of the different insights you've come up with, you've also come up with a few ideas, or you've come up with one main idea that you think is a good one to go forward with. So how do we decide whether or not we should move forward, or how do we see whether it's working or what needs to be fixed? We can go through user testing and use different user testing methods. These are just a few, but there are many more that you can use to try and figure out whether or not your ideas or your concept is going to work. So for example, you can go up to random people in public and ask, like, give them a prototype or just describe your idea to them and ask them for their thoughts to test your product. Or you could also say you already have some like prototype of your thing working. You can go up to people and say, ask them to use it and observe them and see how they're using it. Are they using it as intended? Are they kind of like deviating from the task that you'd expect, or are they actually using it in a way that you really wanted to design your product to guide them towards? So maybe further concretizing this in our example about the COVID vaccine website, say you ask someone to use it and you expect them to click on the navigation bar, but for some reason, maybe they're just like scrolling way down the page on their first use, and you're like, that's not what's supposed to happen. So getting people to test your design really helps show you how accurate you think your design is working, and whether it's working as intended. So moving on from user testing, say you've got a concept that you think has been tested a good amount, and then you're like, okay, I want this to really work. So the last step tends to be prototyping and fabrication. This means that you'll be actually making your design and maybe in a physical form. If it's a digital design for like a website or a mobile app, this might mean you're creating it on Figma in a way where it's like if you click on the buttons on the present view, it will actually go to the realistic frame that it would go to in real life if it was a real app or a real website. And again, for example, if this was a physical design, say an architectural product, this might be creating a wooden model so that you have a 3D version of it so you can see exactly how it fits together, whether gravity is on your side, whether you figured out the shapes properly. And I'd like to just note that maybe after you've prototyped it, you will continue to iterate on it. I said that prototyping tends to be the last step, but really towards the end, you are going to be jumping to and from all these different steps in the human-centered design process. So we've talked through user research, we've talked through defining problem space, and then after that, we've talked about ideation. So synthesizing all your ideas and then having your concepts, right? But then you go to user testing, and maybe you've realized at this point that the idea you had was really trash, or people aren't using it as you want it to go. And at this point, you'll see that these arrows, the orange and blue arrows, you might step between different steps in this process. So you might go back to ideation. You might decide, okay, that concept wasn't working out the way I wanted it. I'll brainstorm some new ones based on the research I had. Or maybe if you've decided, okay, the concept really works, I've tested it with different people, I've surveyed lots of people, I've talked to different people about it. Okay, now I'm going to go and prototype it. And then maybe during the prototype, you realize that it's impossible to execute. Say you're trying to make the thing on Figma, or you're trying to decide how to code it up, and it's like physically impossible to do so. And at that point, you might decide, okay, I need to redo this. I need to reiterate on how this works. And you have to change the idea or change the concept, and you hop back. And then you go back to user testing. You can basically just like rotate through all these different processes, right? Because as long as you iterate on them, as long as you like keep on testing, that's exactly how you know whether it's improving or not, or that's where exactly you'll get new ideas or new ways to make sure that it really helps people or really solves your design problem. But that is very much the basics of a human-centered design. It really is just an introduction. So if you go to these slides, I will probably link them in the chat right after, but they're also on the portal. You'll be able to see that there are links to different resources. I can show you different user testing methods, different user research methods. But if you're going to design in the industry, whether it's architecture or product design, these will be things that you need to keep in mind. So thank you for listening. Yeah. Ooh. Party react. Okay. Yeah, but if anyone has any questions, feel free to stay behind and ask. Otherwise, that is lecture for today.
I have a question.
Yeah.